Did ancient Jewish scribes writing in Greek change the Hebrew Bible? According to an ancient legend, the Egyptian king Ptolemy II was building a massive library and wanted to include the Jewish law books. So he commissioned 72 Jewish scribes to translate the 5 books of the Torah into Greek in 72 days. According to Philo of Alexandria, the translators worked independently of each other, yet produced the exact same translation. Later retellings of this story would change the number of translators to 70, which is how these texts got the name Septuagint, or LXX, which both mean 70. The story is a folk legend, but Greek-speaking Jews did produce Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, and they have some very interesting differences to the Hebrew text. For example, the Greek version of the book of Jeremiah is 14% shorter than the Hebrew, and there's 2 different Greek versions of the book of Esther that change important aspects of the story. In this video, we're going to look at how the Hebrew and Greek texts differ and the reasons ancient scribes altered the text. To begin, when was the Septuagint produced? First, it's a common misconception that the Septuagint is a single translation. To explain, here's Dr. Will Ross, an expert on the Septuagint.
The Septuagint is not a singular ancient Greek translation that was produced at one time by a committee in one place. That's not what it is, but it's something like that. Essentially, we use the word in academia, Septuagint, to designate a collection of ancient Greek translations from the Hebrew Bible, as well as a handful of ancient Greek compositions that were not translated originally, but written in Greek, all of which was produced by Jews in the late Second Temple period in Judea and also in Ptolemaic Egypt. And the label Septuagint has come to designate kind of all of that.
So the Septuagint was translated in stages. Around the 3rd century BCE, the Torah was completed. Most other books were probably completed by the end of the 2nd century BCE. Various revisions were made between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE. To distinguish the earlier translations from these later revisions, scholars refer to the earliest versions as the Old Greek and the latter as recensions. So, much like the Masoretic Text, the Septuagint is a collection of different texts translated at different times by different communities, not a single work. So what are our oldest copies? Our oldest fragments of these texts date to the 2nd century BCE. Our earliest, mostly complete copies are found in early Christian codexes, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus, all of which date to around the 4th century CE. So we have complete copies that are about 500 years older than our copies of the Masoretic Text. So what are the differences? Perhaps the largest deviation the Septuagint makes from the Masoretic Text is the Book of Jeremiah. The Septuagint is shorter. Around 14% of the Hebrew text is not found in the Septuagint. That's over 3,000 words. The Septuagint also has a completely different arrangement of material, and the Septuagint has additional verses not found in the Masoretic Text. So why are these two versions so different? Prior to the 1950s, many scholars thought that the Septuagint translators were the ones who made changes freely to the Hebrew text. However, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, there were fragments that matched both the Masoretic Text and the Septuagint. This caused scholars to reevaluate.
So 4Q Jeremiah A is the longest fragment of Jeremiah we have. It's the oldest, and it matches the Masoretic Text. It's exactly what we expect to find. But there are 2 other fragments we found, 4Q Jeremiah B and D, that have a Hebrew text that looks exactly like we would expect the source text for the Greek version to look. So for the first time, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found Hebrew texts that match the Greek version, and it confirmed the suspicions that the translator, who was known to be literal, had a text in front of him that was very different from the Masoretic text.
Now the mainstream view is that there were probably two different versions of Jeremiah in Hebrew, used by different communities, and the translators of the Septuagint were accurately copying their version, which was different to the expanded Hebrew version that became the Masoretic text. Both of these versions probably diverged from an even older Hebrew text that is now lost to time, but it serves as a good example that ancient scribes could adapt texts to better suit their communities. Another good example of this is the book of Esther. The story of Esther is about a Jewish woman who becomes queen of Persia and uses her position to save her people from a plot of genocide orchestrated by the king's advisor Haman. The version you'll read in a modern Protestant or Jewish Bible comes from the Masoretic text. It has some interesting features. It never mentions God by name, there are no religious elements like prayers, and Esther willingly marries the king of Persia. However, Catholic and Orthodox Bibles include additions found in the Septuagint, which adds about 100 verses. The Septuagint uses God about 50 times. It includes prayers and refers to the laws of Deuteronomy. And the translators of the Septuagint were clearly concerned about Esther's marriage to a non-Jew, so in Greek she is reluctant and marries the king only out of duty. Additionally, in the Hebrew text, Esther and Mordecai are both main characters, but in the Septuagint, Mordecai is given more importance. But to make things even more complex, there's not one Greek version, there's two. In addition to the Septuagint, there's a second Greek version called the Alpha text. It also has the additional material and religious elements, but it is the shortest of the three. So what do scholars make of these three versions?
Today, most scholars look at the Old Greek text as a translation from a Masoretic-like text, right? So there are some differences. The two Hebrew texts, the source of the Old Greek version and the Masoretic version, may not have looked totally identical, but they were pretty close to each other. So that part of it is more or less settled. But of course, within that process, you have to allow for the addition of these 6 parts of Esther, but the language suggests the additions were composed in Greek and inserted to sort of fill out the story to some effect, perhaps for theological reasons. The Alpha text is more debated. Some will look at the Alpha text as a revision of the Old Greek version. They would say, okay, this is not an independent translation, it's a revision of an existing Greek version. But some would suggest that the Alpha text is an independent translation, and it's an independent translation of a completely unknown, otherwise unknown, shorter Hebrew text.
Regardless, it's another example that texts could undergo development. They weren't necessarily static, and they could reflect different ideologies among different communities. Here's another example of a possible ideological change. Does God have regrets? In the story of the flood in Genesis 6:6, a literal translation of the Masoretic text reads, "And the Lord regretted that he had made mankind upon the earth." However, the Septuagint translators seem to have had a theological problem with the idea that God has regrets, so they used a different word, and the text reads, "And God reflected that he made humankind upon the land."
Okay, the translator gets to this word in Hebrew, which is naham, and he uses a Greek version, enthumemai, and it's something more like cogitate, right? Reflect over, perhaps regret, ponder. So it does seem to reflect the translator coming to this point in the Hebrew text, perhaps within his reading community, right? Translation was not done in a vacuum. This is not the first time these translators had ever read these texts, of course. He's asking the same question that contemporary interpreters of Genesis and theologians ask themselves too, which is, what does this mean for God to feel this emotion? So I think it's a great illustration of the fact that similar interpretive quandaries have faced readers of Scripture for millennia.
But what about an example where the Septuagint preserves the earlier reading? You know the story of David and Goliath? Well, the Septuagint version is much shorter than the Masoretic text. For example, as you can see here, the Greek text of 1 Samuel 17 in blue is missing large sections found in the Hebrew. The Masoretic text also contains all these redundant double-ups, where the author says the same thing twice. For example, David is introduced to Saul twice, in 2 different ways. Twice, Saul offers David one of his daughters in marriage, and twice, David is appointed as an officer to Saul's army. These double-ups are not found in the shorter Greek Septuagint version. The prevailing view among textual critics is that there were 2 Hebrew stories of David and Goliath. The shorter, found in the Septuagint, is a translation of one of them, and the version found in the Masoretic text is a combination of the 2 stories into one. However, it's worth noting that the relationship between the Greek and Hebrew texts of the books of Samuel is notoriously difficult to understand. Here's Will Ross again to explain.
The texts of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which in the Greek version is called 1st and 2nd Kingdoms, these texts in both Greek and Hebrew are some of the most difficult texts, text critically speaking, to account for. So the textual history, textual transmission of these books in both Hebrew and Greek are some of the most mind-bogglingly complicated.
However, thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we do have an example where the Septuagint likely preserves an earlier reading than the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text says that the height of the giant Goliath is 9 feet tall, basically a fantasy giant, whereas the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls say 6 feet 9 inches, around the height of an NBA player. Here, scholars agree the Septuagint probably preserves the earlier reading, which was exaggerated in the Masoretic text. So with some variants, the Masoretic text preserves the older reading, and sometimes the Septuagint preserves the older reading. These examples highlight some of the different ways ancient biblical texts could develop, and some of the reasons that scribes made changes. And so, while it is true that most of the variants between ancient manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible are minor in nature, such as scribal mistakes, there are some more significant differences. These arise because texts could evolve over time, and ancient communities sometimes had differing ideologies, which led to variations in the text. In the next episode, we're going to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you'll learn even more about the ancient Hebrew traditions that predate the Masoretic text. This video was made possible by the American Academy of Religion and the Henry Luce Foundation. If you'd like to check out more of Dr. Will Ross's work on the Septuagint, I'll leave a link to his blog in the description. My name is Lachlan, and you've been watching Tablets and Temples.